Good afternoon. I'm Chad Holliday. I'm a member of the National Academy of Engineering. I'd like to welcome all the students that have gathered with us today. Our academy was having our meetings this morning talking about issues of our organization, but it's a very special time to have you join us, which is what we're about, is advancing this profession. I would like you to take a minute and look around the room at the exit signs. There's two in the back. There's one over here. In the very unlikely event we have an emergency, if you'd exit orderly as possible, we would appreciate it very much. How many of the students here today are thinking about being an engineer? Great. Now, when you leave, we've got some things to move you a little bit more in that direction for the two people that didn't raise their hand and everybody else. We have 14 grand challenges of engineering. So if you think throughout your career, what are the things you can work on? What are the things you can change from reverse engineering the brain to solving the cybersecurity problem? They're all in here. If you go ahead and solve one of them right away, we can skip a lot of that preliminary stuff. So I encourage you to look at that. And here's a booklet we put together under the leadership of Dr. Dan Mote, our president. It looks back at the last 50 years of engineering accomplishments, what's happened. I think you'll find it quite intriguing, and also looks ahead to the challenges, in addition to the 14 ground challenges, other opportunities we have. I believe if you take one of these, take time to read it, I think it'll open your eyes to many different things you can do around engineering, and I think you'll confirm the fact that you've made a decision that will pay off for you. So one more question for you. So how many people have a cell phone, smartphone, other electronic device? Raise your hand. Now, keep your hand up if you have it with you. Keep your hand up if you haven't turned it off yet. Okay. So it would be great to turn it off or at least silence it so we won't be interrupted. But that's not why I ask you that question. My honor today is to introduce our Foreign Secretary, which might be a little unusual term to you, but he's the member of the Council of the National Academy that looks after our interests outside the borders of the United States, including our members that live outside the U.S. and have nationalities outside, and also the relationships with sister academies like the National Academy of Engineering around the world. Dr. Navarrete is very special in many regards. The reason Vinky decided to be an engineer was because his dad was an engineer. And he had the experience growing up in India of seeing what his dad was leading. What you have here today is some of you might have dads or moms that are engineers, but what you're going to have exposure to are absolutely outstanding engineers, and Vinky is one of them. The reason I mentioned the cell phone, although the actual invention of the cell phone came much later, Vinky led AT&T Bell Labs semiconductor electronic research. And some of the breakthroughs they had there that made precursor devices by a couple decades were fundamental in creating that cell phone that you had in your hand or thinking about. So as you think about becoming an engineer, think about the example that Vinky sets by doing that research. He also served as 11 years as Dean of Engineering at a little school called Harvard. It's really trying to move up there in the rankings. You know, it has hope yet. So if that's one of the schools you're considering, you'll see a shining example of this. But what I've learned most, Vinky, from working with you on the council is your passion for making a difference using fundamental research, his background in physics, along with applied engineering. That strong passion is what's taken these ideas and turned them into reality. We're extremely fortunate to have a highly skilled, highly motivational passionate engineer for us to be honoring today, and you now to have your first experience listening to. Vinky, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. It is really a wonderful event to come here today because, in fact, when you get to my age, I'll tell you, a few months ago, I turned 75. And some of my friends from Santa Barbara, from Bell Labs, from Harvard, from Sandia hosted a symposium. And I called my granddaughter, who is 17 years of age, like many of the students here, and is planning to go to college. I said, and I'm very fond of her, and she says, "Dad, congratulations, Dad." And so I said, "I'm 75, I'm nearing 100. And she said, "You're as close to 50. And that meant a lot to me. But now it's 3 months since. It is 3 months since, and I'm definitely on the other side of 75. Now, when you get to this age, you begin to reminisce. And you begin to think about the past. In fact, Chad Halliday asked me which are the places I like to work at, and I gave him Bell Labs as sort of the place, but all the places were formative in my life. But this particular institution, the National Academy of Engineering, was very special because I got elected to the NAE in 1992. In February of 1992, I had just joined Santa Barbara in January of 1992, and my assistant then, Livian LaFrance, brought me this, a Federal Express package. And that time, you should know how old I've become. They sent the book, The First 25 Years. Now Dan Mote sends the next 50 years. So, it came 2 days before the Irvine meeting, and the note said, "We are having our national meeting. Even though you'll be inducted in October, if you come to Irvine, we'll recognize you." And in fact, I actually came here in 1992 at that time. So in a sense, California, Irvine, Santa Barbara have a very special place as well in my heart. But NAE and engineering. So I thought I would give you just a little reflection. Normally, I'm used to giving talks with view graphs, etc. But I said this is a time not for view graphs. And Chad Halliday mentioned the cell phone. This is an iPhone. When I came to this country in 1961 to study, graduate study at Cornell, they had just announced the Philco 3-transistor radio in 1961. My father's radios used to be a kludge, almost as big as this podium, with vacuum tubes. It was a big event that you could listen to the radio. And then, when Bob Dines and I worked together, I was reminiscing, we used to put punch card machines and huge computers, and you'd wait next day to get the answer. So the young people in this room have not seen what has happened. And what Dan Mote's book does for the first 50 years has really spanned my life. So let me just say a couple of things which may be important to you. As Chad mentioned, my father actually got a master's in chemistry and a PhD in chemical engineering. And when I was a high school student in India, Cambridge and England was still God's country. And I had the Cambridge school leaving certificate exam in January, and college would start in July. I had 6 months. So he said, "Come and work in my lab." And I did a lot of experiments, learned actually how to tinker with things. In those days, there were no calculators. There were crank machines, which I did all the calculations. So I would either make a measurement, do those calculations, and my father actually wrote the paper, my first paper. I was co-author with him, but at age 15, it made a huge impression on me. It taught me that it's nice to experiment, to try different things. And then I went and studied physics. So, the British system, Dan Mote earlier at the NAE annual meeting, business meeting, mentioned about Harvard. And Harvard is trying to move up in the rankings. And in fact, for a long period, engineering was not recognized, especially because of certain European traditions. I feel very passionate. So I want to tell you how I morphed from being a physicist into an engineer, and I'm proud to be in that. Actually, Bob Dines and I, who have worked together, and you'll hear from him, we actually went in a slightly different path. I went into the laboratory where he started, and he went into the other laboratory, it also tells you you can take different paths and still be highly successful. So, the other thing which you see, all of you will, all the members of the academy, and you look at the magazine, it displays the bridge. Those brochures which Chad Halliday showed display the bridge. And of course, for some of you, the bridge probably means the bridges which you have in California. I always loved the Golden Gate Bridge. In Boston, it was the Cable Stay Bridge. But the bridge I want to talk about is actually much more sort of virtual. It's a bridge where actually you bridge disciplines and where you look at the whole, which in my view is the essence of engineering. So after I did my physics degree at Cornell, one of the things which is central in my view is scientific and engineering revolutions. Chad mentioned what happened with the cell phones and the engineering history. I actually morphed from being a physicist to Dean of Engineering, member of the National Academy. You should know, it is not the National Academy of Engineers, it's the National Academy of Engineering. And so what you do is different, as Dan has often pointed out, and I want to emphasize that. You can start anywhere and take different paths and come together. So the thing which I finally did by coming to Santa Barbara and getting elected to the NAE, I finally felt I was accepted. I was professor of electrical and computer engineering, not professor of physics. But many of the people who had come to Santa Barbara had come from Bell Labs, where I spent much of my career. So I want to spend a few minutes on why that place made a difference. People talk about industrial laboratories, and there are many great industrial laboratories. But there was no distinction between disciplines. Basically, materials was a very significant central element. You brought physics and chemistry to understand the materials, and you brought engineering so that you could actually make something out of it. So in fact, there was a deep union between physics, chemistry, materials, and engineering, with materials as a central role. And so I've been thinking about the nature of scientific and engineering revolutions. So in this time of reflection, I've spent the last year writing a book on the cycle of invention and discovery. Because when you have Nobel Prizes, you often find people forget the word invention. What I learned, even from the work which I did with Bob Dines, you actually invent some kind of new tool, and then you can discover something. So in fact, it is so integral, and I want to come back to that point. So in this book, I do a case history of a whole lot of Nobel Prizes. A lot, I felt, of Draper Prizes. The Draper Prizes, which engineering started 25 years ago or so, it turns out some of them were precursors of Nobel Prizes. And sometimes the Nobel Prize came before. This year, the NAE Draper Prize and the Nobel Prize are the same for the light-emitting diode. So the message is that is it physics? Is it engineering? Is it materials? It's all of the above. Is it a discovery or is it an invention? It's both. And we need to build this bridge and not have a hierarchical order. So that's sort of the essence of the book. And I've read now the history. So in this book, I don't want to trace because we'll spend 2 hours, 70,000 words. We do look at Bell Labs through interviews with other people. We look at Santa Barbara, why there was a university, which was a small community college, a marine college, and suddenly became a preeminent place in science and engineering. There were many elements to it, which we go into it. It can be done in a university. It does not have to be an industrial laboratory. There are other examples. And Harvard finally realized, there was this pecking order because we had the European origins, and people said the abstract thinking is the highest, and then comes physics, maybe then comes chemistry, biology, and in those days they didn't even think about engineering. Actually, when you look at the facts, engineering or tools and technology took their own path, and science and technology are mirror over twins. And I started thinking and became, over the last 5 years, my final transition into a social scientist. I'm a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School who sets public policy, even though my main allegiance is still with the School of Engineering, which is where my heart is. But then I learned a whole lot of social science and realized that, in fact, engineering, and one of the things which National Academy of Engineering did was to create the great problems facing society. So I show my students, I teach a course, Introduction to Technology, for freshmen. people like the young people in this room, and I start what the things which inspired me. Things which, of course, work in my father's lab, the kind of professors I had. But really, when I came, it was the beginning of the transistor revolution. It was a very exciting time to do what was called solid-state physics or electrical engineering. You can argue which one it is. They sort of grew together. And then, actually, the space race happened, and President Kennedy gave 1961 is the year my wife and I came to the United States at all of age 21, and President Kennedy gave a speech at Rice University. All you young people, all my students at Harvard see it, should Google that speech. It's a very moving speech as to why we should go to the moon. And he says, and many people questioned him, there are so many hard problems at home. And he said, it is a frontier. It's a new frontier, and we as a nation must do something which is hard, something which defines us as a people. And we don't know what the benefits will be. It'll be for all mankind. It really is a moving speech by a president of ours. And in fact, the space program then led to this wonderful accomplishment for engineering, especially which makes your parents and grandparents really happy because they know where you are, because the GPS, which was the early winners of the Draper Prize, is probably one of the most important things. The other thing which I learned then in teaching this is there are great creativity is there in every discipline. It's in physics, it's in engineering, it is in art, it is in social science. It's basically having original ideas and thoughts. Inventions is having original ideas and thoughts which have some value. And innovation is when you actually impact the society broadly. And we need to understand that. And invention and creativity are intimately tied to each other. And it is wrong to separate them in the way sometimes our European experts said. The thing which made the biggest impression on me when I was writing this book, because I wanted others, when physicists wrote, Pierre Degene, Nobel Prize, Google him, Nobel Prize winning physicist from Paris, who explained liquid crystals and polymers, he said the French system was broken. He would have graduate students whom he wanted to learn to show how detectors work. And this poor graduate student didn't think about simply this is what the signal will be, this is how much energy is required. He says, Professor Degene, how do I diagonalize the Hamiltonian? He said, all was lost. So the book is about the dance between ideas and tools, between theory and practice, between abstraction and concreteness. And we must bridge those divides. And the final divide, which I learned after going to Harvard, and the reason I went to Harvard was because I knew the undergraduates who were there were extremely bright. After all, Bill Gates didn't even finish and created Microsoft. Mark Zuckerberg was second-year computer science student and created Facebook and all the social media. So I show these students two opening view pieces. There's a Kennedy and Obama piece, and there is a piece which is actually Neil Armstrong. He meant a lot to me because I also was a young, finished my graduate study and gone to Bell Labs, and seeing him land on the moon. And NAE produced a wonderful little thing as part of this E4 video on Armstrong describing the great achievements of engineering. And he describes himself as a nerdy engineer, steeped in the laws of thermodynamics, solving Laplace's equations and so on, and all these things happened. And then I show a picture of Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs walks in his confident way. And remember, all of the technology came from Bell Labs or IBM or Xerox PARC or some such place. But nevertheless, he had one very important idea. He said, technology alone is not enough. Technology must intersect with the liberal arts. I want to make technology which makes your heart sing. And that really is what I have learned, that engineering and technology must relate to the social milieu, and that's what ultimately bridging all the boundaries is. That's where the grand challenges, the grand challenge scholars, and in that sense, NAE has had a profound influence in me and is beginning to have a profound influence in an institution like Harvard, where we want to train Renaissance engineers, people who think broadly, and that doesn't mean we don't need the specialists, but there is room for this broader milieu where you actually bridge the boundaries. So remember, the NAE bridge, that's what the world is about. Thank you. I have now a duty to do. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our president, Dan Mote. He's the president of the National Academy of Engineering and Regents Professor in Leave from the University of Maryland, College Park. He held an endowed chair in mechanical systems at the University of California, Berkeley, and chaired the mechanical engineering department for many years. In 1998, he was recruited to the presidency of the University of Maryland, College Park, a position he held until 2010 when he was appointed Regents Professor. He stood for election as president of the NAE at 2013 and assumed the office on July 1st, 2013. Dr. Mote.
Well, thank you very much, Venki, for your remarks. I think very, very profound remarks for young people and old people, for that matter. His association of engineering with people and society is something I never learned when I was your age, and it was a big problem. It set me back decades, as a matter of fact. I think thinking about that soon and early is really a good idea. I mean, I really support that. In fact, engineering is all about creating solutions for people and society. That's what engineering is about. And so the sooner we engineers, all of us, wannabes and actuals, get this straight, the more effective we can be.